Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk briefly about the Guatemala city and a course which I held regularly at Yale because I was invited by Robert Stern to teach, even though I'm a reluctant teacher. And I do that every 2 or 3 years, and I have always about 10 students. I master plan with a studio urbano, a new town outside Guatemala City, now for 12 years, which is building and becoming a successful urban quarter. And in 2013, I held a seminar with my students how this idea of building a new urban quarter could be replicated in Guatemala City itself in order to create a new capital city for Guatemala. Normally, I work with the students for a month. We give them 10 different buildings. Each student has to measure a classical building in all its details, very great detail. And then we produce a book of all these documents, because the students at Yale generally have not ever designed or drawn a traditional classical building. Then we produce a lexicon of these parts of each building. We have to extract all the parts of the building and organize a lexicon of architectural parts, and then recompose the building with the same parts. And these are exercises which often take, and I really impose the use of computers, because it's not so much about drawing, but about conceptualizing traditional architecture. And so we use the same parts, make completely new buildings with these existing parts. And so the creativity, we don't demand creativity. We think that people generally are creative, so we don't have to bother about originality or creativity. It's the least of our concern. The thing is that an architect and an artist has to produce good buildings and good towns so that people live well there. And once you accept that architecture is language or building, it's just like any spoken language. Once you start speaking it, you cannot help doing your own version of the language. You recognize immediately a personality when he uses language. It's something unavoidable, like bodies, like the perfume of a body or the color of the skin. We shouldn't worry about the originality, because we are originally whether we like it or not. So it's none of our concern. No. It's just like you play a piece of music, you can play exactly the notes written by a composer, it becomes your own piece. You cannot not avoid being personal, so it's none of our concerns. Within 3 months, these students, generally, they are Yale is a very selective school, so they are brilliant students, they want to learn, they work day and night, and in 3 months we have fantastic architects who can design classical buildings, which is something which sounds almost unimaginable. So Guatemala City, I took the students there, and in the center of Guatemala City, there's something called Centro Cívico, was built under the dictatorship of General Araña, who was a bloody monster dictator, and led the country into a terrible civil war, which lasted something like 25 years. And the country is slowly coming out of this civil war, terribly hurt and burned and divided. And the way that generally classes have divided there is that the rich live in gated communities and the poor live in slums outside the city, often built by themselves, and they go into the center of town to find work. When I started in 2003, it was 1 million people commuting. Now in 2015, it's 2 million people commuting every day into the city, an incredible waste of time, money, and energy. As much employment of the of Guatemala City is to do with administration. It would of course be easier to put the work where people are and bring people in more permanent way there where there is work, instead of having them to commute in the 21 zones which the city is divided on. Now, Guatemala City was founded to replace, as a capital city, the city of Antigua, which had been destroyed several times by earthquakes and by the eruption of an enormous volcano. And so it was built far away from the major volcano called Agua, on a meseta, and it was organized basically in 5 parts. And but that was the original city, which was built like really a city built according to the law of the Indies, and since then it has expanded enormously. And because the original mesa was not big enough, they have built on many mesas, and but they are very badly connected. That is one thing. The second characteristic is that the plans by which the Guatemala City was organized didn't really recognize the unique situation and the incredibly interesting situation of the mesas, which have these great shapes, incredible relationship to the countryside, but because the urban grid which was implanted on these mesetas has no border avenue, has no border boulevard, has no walkable or drivable edge, you never know where you are. It's extremely chaotic. It's very difficult to find your way. So there are several ways which went about this. So there is the existing network, very large-scale network, and these. Yeah. So you see, it's very large. This is the old city, the first foundation of Guatemala City, and then these suburbs which are built on these mesas, cut up by a great amount of canyons. With Maria Sanchez and Pedro Godoy, we are master planning virtually a new town which is built outside, just outside and above the historic Guatemala City, divided by canyons. And we have virtually now realized this first quarter, and we are now planning these new quarters, which include university, many schools. On the side of these, there are often gated communities. Some of these are gated communities which were created before and which we try now to open. This is the first phase which was realized over the last 4 years. This is the main building done by Richard Economakis, a professor of Notre Dame University. The church which is going to be built is done by Maria Sanchez and Pedro Godoy, and they are the lead architects of this project, which is becoming a new city center for Guatemala City. When I took the students from Yale there, we lived in this new hotel which the developer had specially finished for us. We lived on the Plaza Mayor, overlooking the town. This is a quarter which we just planned, which is going to expand the existing. So this situation, Guatemala City itself, the historic center, the Centro Cívico is here, and here these enormous suburbs which every day draw 2 million people into it, and to an absolute chaotic situation. What we proposed, there's a plan de ordinación territorial, which foresees to develop throughout this network 33 kilometers of extremely high urban development with skyscrapers, and that's supposed to resolve the problem of density. It's completely childish, it's insane, it's not, it won't solve anything. Instead, we propose here, this was an academic project, we proposed to divide the 21 zones. These are the zones, 21 zones. Instead, to foresee over the next 20 years a development of 160 urban quarters and villages, which would allow people not only to live but also to work in proximity within pedestrian distances, but above all to create new center, because there is no real center. The city is not only zoned functionally but above all socially. The rich live in zone 10 and zone 16 and so on, and the poor live all around, often in favelas, in absolutely terrible conditions. The local the Indian indigenous population have virtually occupied the old historic center where the wealthier classes never go, and it's only an area basically now for indigenous population and tourism. And that is what I thought, because this is a country which is still very, very Catholic, very practicing. A lot of, they are very strongly motivated by a religious model. They go to church, and that is really quite touching. That is what also I think gives to the developers and the richer population, at least we discussed it, that it is their duty to actually build again a city which is open to all classes and not divisive and not fomenting violence and rancor. And this is largely happening with this first urban development, which is called Kayala. Now, but on the other hand, there's a private development, and in order for a country to be really reformed, I thought it was important to conceive a model which would do to Guatemala maybe what Brasilia did to Brazil, to give a focus of building, but to really bring a promise of a unified society, non-divided society, rather than Brasilia, which is like a city for the rich and the poor live outside. So, and this would happen right in center, and particularly be like a new, not only an urban center, but also a symbolic center, because there is no real architectural valuable symbol for this society, exactly like for Europe. We don't really have a capital of Europe, even though we have this very large unified project to unify Europe economically. I think it's very important to have also architecturally powerful, symbolic centers in order for people to have positive reference, rather than an idea of bureaucracy, of bureaucratization, of codification, of control. Now, there's an absolute fantastic place where this could happen. In the north, this is the old historic center, and this is called the Centro Cívico, which is many skyscrapers, a national theater, the municipality, the Olympic Stadium, which is now the basic administrative center. It's about 40 hectares, I think, and to build in that, devastate completely tabula rasa, destroy these odious buildings of the dictatorship, and create a new Jerusalem, a new white city, a shining white city, to become the symbol of the whole population of the different classes of Guatemala. Now, I really enjoy to do this tabula rasa situation, because I want to punish, to return the violence from where it came. And so we'll just clear it. There is no way these buildings can be reformed. I found out that actually, after we had declared that we are going to devastate them, we found out that actually all these buildings are condemned in the very short term, because they do not respond to the codes of seismic security. They are often top-heavy, which is the worst for once you have a strong tremor. And so all this would be devastated, and we would, Donatio Memoria would this time be turned around, and we would create this new city, which becomes the center. The idea is that we create very much like Nîmes, or often historic centers. I grew up in a small capital city like that, where the center is surrounded by a boulevard, which really very clearly limits the historic center and removes it, but also heightens it, creates something which is really a place of high symbolic value. This will be, so first we surround this by a mall, a national mall, 150-meter wide park, And then we have this new historic center, which becomes the capital of Guatemala. Small capital, not a sprawling capital, as is general, but really a much reduced bureaucracy with very powerful collective buildings. Like we have the federal city and the civic city. The civic city is crowned by the municipal building, and here is built on the model of the federal city of Washington. You have the executive, the parliament, and the judicial system forming this basic plan. It's divided in 4 quarters, and the main building, the main symbolic building, dominate the perspectives. The main symbolic buildings are also situated on axes which are very, very important as you come in. So they are a choice location where to put a dome or a powerful iconic building to mark not only the city itself, but also to have a very powerful influence on the existing network around. Major traffic comes into these squares, arrives in these squares, which would be organized like London green squares, which is a way to receive large amounts of traffic and yet to not have, doesn't look like a traffic junction. And the major symbolic buildings are set on these hard squares, hard paved squares, and create this kind of also an institutional distance and dignity. I have to go very quickly. I deliver the master plan, and then students have to design topography, have to design a major monumental building and a series of residential blocks. There was a choice of 4 different architectures. The Antigua was our main source. 2 students could choose Otto Wagner, 1 student Le Corbusier, and 2 people could choose Art Deco. Then they have to put these, to register these existing architectural languages and order them in a lexicon, which becomes then operational and to be used either as classical or as vernacular building. And here I show the projects. And now the major, so just one thing missing is that on the crossing of these major axes, we have a very large covered square, which would be like the symbol of an open society, covered square protecting from the sun, from the rain, and which is non-institutional open structure, which sits right in the middle, becomes not only a focal building, but also a focal square and a symbolic center for all of society. This was a student who designed who put Otto Wagner architecture on the computer. He used even Patrick Schumacher's system, parametric system, but designed instead of doing that kind of architecture. With the computer you can within minutes design something like 150 urban blocks with very lovely patios and so on. Then another student she thought she had incredible gifts, intelligent and very gifted, fantastic person, but she thought she was not, she had no talent for architecture. I said, if you have no talent for architecture, you start with fascist architecture, which needs very little effort to design. So she studied the buildings of the EUR in Rome and took them as reference and designed this absolutely, I think, fascinating building, which would be the new municipality. So design only when you start. Fascist architecture is actually a very good way because it's relatively abstract, has very little moves. The orders are often simplified, so it's easy to get into and do it correctly, and then move towards more adorned ways. This was a Chinese student. She designed the executive mansion and gardens, and then the urban blocks, and so on. So we definitely use existing sources, but also sometimes this is like this gate of the Carmen in Antigua, but used as a tetrapylon Instead of having just a bridge, it becomes a pavilion which is carried into the silhouette of the city and marks major axes. And these are these palazuelos, we call them palacitos, all with underground parking, either under several blocks. This is like the larger block has a single parking with garages. Always the ramps are in features like an arcade, just like a walking arcade, but this is an arcade for cars, so it becomes very agreeable structure, just like Rafael Manzano has done this a lot in Seville. To have the garage entrance is always a beautiful entrance, not just for dirty vehicles and so on. And that's a parliament building. I have to go quickly, which would be carried, and you have this, the girl, she fell in love with the university in Antigua and used this, what are they called, mixed center arches. ¿Cómo se llaman estos arcos? Mixed linear arches. And forms this mixed linear. You have a courtyard of the parliament building overlooking the square and is on the highest position of the... this was a woman who is a business major, and she just visited my seminars, and within 2 weeks she had designed one of the most beautiful... this is again one of the Otto Wagner alumni, a national cathedral, ecumenical, a cathedral on the highest point. And then I always have one student who has to make Le Corbusier urbain. So use a Corbusier, a particular style of Corbusier, and turn into an urban language. It's very difficult. It's generally not quite satisfactory, but it's always beginning to civilize Corbusier. And then after, when there's time, they have to translate this into traditional architecture. So, no, with a bit of effort, we can turn Le Corbusier into a decent fellow. Another Chinese student. I thought this was a very interesting project. An Art Deco project. The problem with Art Deco and with modernist architecture, even when you render it urban, but the language is often so reduced that wherever you do it becomes independent of the culture. So you can often produce a very attractive, like Miami Beach has, or New Zealand, there's very attractive Art Deco city, but they are the same. Whereas traditional architecture has much more resources, local resources, much more capacity, a wider vocabulary to give it very strong identity related to the soil and to the climate and to the altitude. And this was our best student. He had been discouraged by other teachers to go purely into development, have no more to do with architecture, just become developer. Brilliant man. He's now also an associate of, I'm ready, of Robert Stern Associates. This was the urban block with an integrated car park, only a car park under a single urban block. And this was his justice forum. Never done a traditional building before. There we are.